Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war taking place between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, we have entered day 119 of the ongoing conflict. So first and most importantly, we are continuing to see Russian moves to the southeast of Lysychansk. That pocket continues to tighten and close itself on Ukrainian forces, both within the area near Zolat and to the north in the area near Lysychansk. And then obviously there's continued Ukrainian offensive operations ongoing. They have been recently as far as roughly 10 kilometers by some reports that Ukrainian forces have pushed within 10 kilometers of the city of Kherson. Now, obviously, the Russians have launched some counterattacks, then pushing Ukrainian forces back. And we'll have a look at that here in a second. And also, what I wanted to do is try and provide a analytical viewpoint on quite possibly what the future is going to bring for this conflict. And unfortunately, for some viewers of the channel, you're probably not going to like what I have to say. And again, it's not any sort of bias. It's just my analytical view in terms of how the conflict is progressing, how both sides are continuing to operate, and continuing to prepare and make their armies either more capable or in some cases less capable in the ongoing war. And first and foremost, what I want to do is talk about the way the Ukrainian army has performed over the course of the last 119 days has been very admirable. I believe that most outside observers, high-ranking Pentagon officials, the chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff and his advisors obviously believed that Kiev, the capital, would fall within roughly the first 80 hours of the conflict. And Ukrainian forces in the operational area of northern Ukraine, specifically west, north, and northeast of Kiev, were successfully able to counter that Russian offensive that had its sights set on seizing control of Kiev. And I understand that some observers believe that it was some sort of diversionary attack. It was not a diversionary attack. It was a full concerted effort by the Russians to seize Kiev. And through some internal processes, internal errors that were made by Russian command staff in terms of preparation for the conflict, and the inability of Russian logistics to continue to supply forces at the same time, dealing with a very robust and aggressive Ukrainian defensive operation in this area, kind of led to what we see now in terms of the Russians eventually having to pull back. Now, with that being said, it's very important to also look at the future and the way the conflict is currently being fought. And I'll get into that here in a second, but first I just want to have a quick look again at what we're seeing on the actual battlefield. And if we scroll in again, we're continuing to see this operation by Russian forces really focused on right now engaging the Ukrainian military in the field with lots of heavy artillery. We're hearing now that the Russians are expending up to 50 to 70,000 artillery shells per day at Ukrainian forces. And in terms of actual tactical air assets, helicopter gunships, fixed wing assets, we're seeing anywhere from 100 to up towards 300 sorties per day, and that obviously includes cruise missile attacks as well. And right now, as we had talked about in the previous episode, Russian forces have severed the main arterial route from Lysychansk down to Zolot, and it is becoming increasingly more difficult for Ukrainian forces to supply any combat units really in this area of the map you're looking at now. We anticipate that the area around Zolot could fall within hours, possibly days. Now, obviously, we've talked about the possibility of territorial gains by the Russians, and obviously it doesn't always immediately come to fruition in terms of how quickly the Russians advance. But it does look right now there is a fairly significant maneuver operation by Russian forces to circumvent the area around Lysychansk very, very quickly. Not just the remaining pocket of Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk are going to be completely cut off, but also the combat units that are operating within the environments near Lysychansk as well will be cut off and quite possibly may not have the ability to conduct a tactical withdrawal or a retreat towards Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and Bakhmut, which is also going to be an eventual target of Russian forces. We continue to see this methodical drive by Russian forces in terms of how they are performing in the field, especially in the Sloviansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut triangle. In the south, we did see a limited Ukrainian offensive directly down the M14 highway towards the city of Kherson. Now, the question is this designed to draw Russian forces from other areas, or is it a concerted effort by Ukrainian forces to retake the city of Kherson? And what we'll do is we'll kind of go back and look at from June 21st till today. So obviously, if we fast forward things, you can see the salient, this bulge down the M14 highway as Ukrainian forces attacked. Again, this area became contested, and then there was a Russian counterattack driving Ukrainian forces back towards Mykolaiv. So this is going to take a while to resolve itself. We do not anticipate that Ukrainian forces will be eventually successful in retaking control of Kherson. I think at this point these are more or less diversionary attacks by Ukrainian forces. Now, where are we heading in this war? What is the end game right now? What is the strategy on both sides? And unfortunately, for the Ukrainian side, they are taking horrendous losses. Now, obviously, if you turn into mainstream media, you don't really hear that much. If you listen to the Ukrainian government, they are starting to talk about losses a bit more. And clearly, the losses that they are taking are of great concern for members of the government, because I think a lot of this information in terms of what actually is happening on the ground is now making it to key leaders in the actual Ukrainian government. The Russians are also taking losses as well, not in terms of the same extent that they were taking losses in the initial start of the campaign, and that again is because the Russians are not maneuvering the same way as they were at the very start of the campaign. And right now, the types of losses that the Ukrainians are taking, both in material and manpower, is simply not sustainable for Ukrainian forces to continue to specifically resist east of the Dnieper River. Obviously, it will take some time for Russian forces to eventually cause this collapse in the Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper River. But given the amount of casualties that are being that is occurring in the Ukrainian military, I would say that no later than October or November, we will probably see the general collapse of Ukrainian forces in the eastern sector of the country, the east of the Dnieper River, especially in areas that we're looking at right now. Right now, we've finally obtained information that indicates that, at least in material losses, most Ukrainian combat brigades are sitting at about 50% initial operating capacity in terms of heavy equipment, tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, and heavy artillery. So 50% loss overall. Some units 30%, other units upwards to 40 to 50% losses. Some units even higher than that. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the supply efforts by Western nation states, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, United States, NATO, United Kingdom, what have you, are simply not providing the types of resources that will give the Ukrainian military the ability to continue the tempo of the conflict that we are currently seeing. Again, as I talked about earlier, the Russians are sending downrange 50 to 70,000 rounds per day of artillery rounds, and that's multiple launch rocket systems, heavy artillery, heavy mortars, what have you, in the direction of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are usually expending anywhere from 3 to 6,000 rounds of artillery per day. And given the casualty rates that we're seeing right now in terms of the casualties that the Ukrainians are being inflicted upon by the Russian forces, it is going to be very, very difficult for the Ukrainian military to continue organized resistance in terms of being able to maneuver in the field against Russian forces. And we will probably see within the next 90 days a general collapse of Ukrainian forces in the field, especially in the east of the country. And quite possibly because of the level of attrition that is taking place inside of the Ukrainian military, there is a distinct possibility we could see the general collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces, quite possibly within that time frame as well. So, best case scenario, I would say by November is Ukrainian forces would have to start a massive retreat, or we would see the Russians really starting making headway in the east of the country, probably sometime within October, November. Worst case scenario is the entire Ukrainian military apparatus starts to collapse, which is also a very, very distinct possibility. We continue to see Russia increase the size of its force construct. Obviously, it's not having a nationwide mobilization that is overt in nature. However, it continues to be more or less covert in nature, but the Russian military is mobilizing itself. It does have the ability and the capacity to increase force level strength in terms of pulling weapons and armaments out of depots, and and then creating new combat units or reinforcing existing combat units, merging existing combat units. Ukrainians do not have that ability right now. A lot of Ukrainian depots, armed depots, have been destroyed. The ability of the Ukrainian military to produce what it needs to fight the war is simply not being produced now, and they're really relying on the shipment of Western weapons. Now, the problem is with the deliveries of these Western systems, we're just not seeing them in the types of numbers that would be needed for the Ukrainian military to start a successful counter operation. Because right now, the Ukrainians are simply trying not to lose. And they, again, are performing very tenaciously, but ultimately they are getting worn down by Russian forces. And eventually they're just not going to be able to perform in the field given the types of casualties and the destruction of equipment and also, more importantly, the ammunition that is starting to wear thin for the Ukrainians. And as we talked about this Western equipment, yes, we hear about the delivery of 7 howitzers, 10 multiple launch rocket systems, but the reality is the Ukrainians would have to see these systems be delivered in the hundreds in order for the Ukrainians to be successful. You would have to see hundreds of tanks being delivered. You would have to see hundreds and hundreds, probably upwards to 1,000 pieces of heavy artillery being delivered by Western nations, and quite possibly another 500 to 1 million rounds of heavy artillery for the Ukrainians to be successful. And unfortunately, they're not being delivered in those amounts to necessitate the continued adequate defense of the country, but also any hopes of any sort of counteroffensive, which is so far from remote right now. It's not even worth talking about. I understand there is propaganda going on, and the Ukrainians have been very, very good at creating some false narratives and different pictures in terms of hoping to maintain morale inside of the country. And the Russians are guilty of the same types of things as well, in terms of attempting to hide certain losses and attempting to articulate why certain missions were conducted that ended in failure. But the end game right now, the way the current conflict is going, does not look good for Ukrainian forces. Again, they're going to need a lot more than what is being sent to Ukraine, as opposed to what is actually being delivered and talked about. And obviously, there's even a lot of propaganda around that coming from Western states about the amounts of equipment that are being delivered, and it's very, very hyped in terms of that equipment that is being delivered. But ultimately, and it does risk that escalation that I've talked about quite often, and that risk of escalation is omnipresent right now. But is that equipment that is currently being delivered going to change the dynamic on the ground and the way the conflict is progressing? And the answer to that, unfortunately, right now for Ukrainian forces is no. And the trajectory right now is ultimately probably for a Russian victory. Now, how much how much territory do the Russians seize? Difficult to say. Now, this is in terms of when I say a Russian victory, I'm not looking at the possible insurgency aspect of this conflict, and what I'm looking at is organized resistance by Ukrainian forces, meaning brigades, battalions in the field maneuvering against Russian forces. And the way we're heading right now is that ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to be able to maneuver in brigade, battalion-sized elements and effectively launch limited counteroffensive and organized defensive operations are going to be greatly reduced within the next 90 days. And then possibly what happens again September, October, November, we could look at something very unfortunate happening for Ukrainian forces. Now, with that being said, how much territory does Russia absorb, and then what does that look like? Because that is going to cause problems and challenges for Russian forces, obviously very distinct and separate from the maneuver, organized warfare side of the equation. The Russians are going to probably face a ongoing insurgency in some of the occupied areas that it has taken, and that's a separate issue, completely separate than the current organized state of affairs in terms of the ability of Ukrainian forces to resist with an organized armed forces. And again, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, that is being degraded day by day. And again, things do not look good. I would say things are very precarious right now for Ukrainian forces, and especially the trajectory of where the conflict is heading, especially when we get into October and November, things are not going to look good if the conflict is still going at the same tempo and pace that we see right now. But one more thing to note, just real quick, I wanted to talk about this even before I kind of got into predictions and where things were heading. There was another reported attack on Snake Island by Ukrainian forces, up to 14 drones and shore-based systems engaged Russian targets on Snake Island. The Russians have reported this and claimed to have shot down numerous Ukrainian drones that were operating within the vicinity of Snake Island. Furthermore, the Ukrainians have attacked oil platforms to the south of Odessa, kind of in this vicinity here where my cursor is circling. These platforms were being used, obviously, by Russian forces as reconnaissance sites and sites that had long-range radars, and military-related systems. So were they a legitimate military target for the Ukrainians to attack? I would say, yeah, absolutely. The Russians are going after economic targets that can facilitate war. So what's good for the Russians is good for the Ukrainians as well in terms of what they were going after in terms of those oil platforms. We also received reports that Ukrainian forces have struck oil facilities inside of Russia proper, to east of Mariupol and kind of west of Rostov. And we've seen this before, where Ukrainian forces have launched attacks inside of Russia proper. And as things continue to deteriorate for Ukrainian forces, I would say it's very much possible we could see even more audacious, possibly attacks by Ukrainian forces against Russian targets in Russia proper. Right now, I think the only real hope for Ukrainian forces, and I think we've kind of gotten past that right now, I think would have been when the Russians were withdrawing from the areas near Kiev and northeast Ukraine. I still maintain that the Ukrainians are really going to would have needed to get really audacious and aggressive. And I had talked about the possibility of an operation into Belarus by Ukrainian forces, or a operation in the Transnistria region as well. I think at this point that may have passed in terms of the degrading of Ukrainian capabilities to launch such types of operations. But I think the only really way for the Ukrainians to ultimately win this would have been to get very, very aggressive and create a scenario in which the Russians would have basically been threatened with a collapse of possibly the regime in Belarus, or very aggressive operations by Ukrainian forces. And I fear, at least for Ukrainian forces, that time may have passed. I think it's still possible we could see some sort of counter operation by Ukrainian forces, but as each day passes, the Ukrainians are getting much more weaker, and the Russians, for all intents and purposes, are probably getting stronger and stronger day by day. And that pretty much does it for today. I do know that the October-November prediction that I talked about is not going to be unpopular, and I understand that, or is going to be popular with some viewers and unpopular with other viewers. And I know the truth can be painful sometimes, but that's the way the conflict is unfolding right now. And we'll see how this video ages. And again, thanks for joining us today. Have a good day.